We're going to kick things off here in just a couple of minutes with the Chief Technology Architect at the DTCC, Mr. Rob Palatnick. Rob is going to be talking about building trust in a trustless environment. You might have heard some of the other panelists today address the DTCC. I'm going to let him address some of the comments that have been made, perhaps offer a couple of rebuttals, and just generally welcome him to the stage, Mr. Rob Palatnick.
Thank you very much. First, I do want to have a shout out to all the previous panelists that did mention DTCC. It always amazes me how many infrastructure fans we have. So for those of you who we do have hats and merchandise. We've just started that recently. Looking for new revenue sources. We're here to support the industry. So I'm delighted to be able to spend a few minutes discussing and addressing this conundrum of how DTCC, owned by the financial industry with trust as our middle name, how we can advance a technology that's built on a model of no trust. Some have described blockchain as a thing of beauty, and some, usually those same individuals, describe DTCC as old. So in that model of age before beauty, let me explain DTCC first. Starting with me, I've been at DTCC for a while. I've been the chief architect at DTCC for over a decade. I know where our mainframe skeletons are buried. I've built a few clearing systems. I'm also the chief cloud advocate, and I'm the chief blockchain distributed ledger evangelist and the chief blockchain distributed ledger skeptic inside of DTCC. I'm also recently, as of February, the chairman of the governing board of Hyperledger, which is a Linux Foundation project. We have now over a dozen different projects under Hyperledger. So a lot of you may have heard about either Fabric, which is one of our stacks, or Sawtooth, or Iroha. But there's over a dozen different projects there. Indy, which is getting a lot of traction as an identity system. Ursa, which is a new cryptography library, and we're looking for more contributions to that cryptography library. But it's all indicative of DTCC's commitment to distributed ledger and to the fact that we really believe open source and open standards are going to be the core of how this industry and how the world transforms. And it's not going to be built on lots of private isolated silos and islands. It's going to be built on a consistent set of open source standards, similar to the way the internet evolved, similar to the way database SQL evolved, and other standards like that. So DTCC has been leading technology innovation for post-trade processing for about almost 5 decades. The industry originally worked with US regulators and the several exchanges to form DTC in 1973. And that was the original instantiation of DTC, was taking security trades from the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange and taking the physical securities, registering them in the vault in DTCC and putting them on exchange so they could be traded in what we thought then was book entry digital form. We've learned now that it's not digital enough, but we'll get to that in a minute. I would remind everybody that back at that period of time, there were 4 or 5 other depositories around the United States. There were other clearing corps around the United States. So DTC wasn't formed as a single consolidated depository for all of the United States markets. It was originally one of multiple. And over the years, we've consolidated and improved efficiencies in the market. So fast forward to 2019. Last year, we processed over 1.85 quadrillion worth of securities transactions across a wide range of financial services. And to address at least one of the comments about DTCC's costs and efficiencies, our average cost for clearing and settlement, a trade that comes in from one of over 50 different exchanges, is much less than a penny. So the costs on a per trade basis that any of you might be paying are not clearing fee. They're not clearing and settlement fees from the depository. Our entire focus and goal of daily processing is safety and soundness of markets and the financial systems that we support. Our focus is on governance. Our focus is on risk management and risk mitigation. We were formed to commoditize and provide economies of scale for all of your firms in the financial industry to support post-trade processing, clearing, settlement, securities, asset servicing, and commoditize those services so each of your firms did not have to spend money on that themselves. So just like any company, we're here to serve our clients, but in fact, we're really not like every other company. We're industry owned and governed. For those of you who are in the financial industry, and you own us. We're an extension of your firm. Our infrastructure is really an extension of your infrastructure, and our priorities are in lockstep with your priorities. Our clients are our owners. Our clients are our shareholders. They're our board of directors, and we do not have any conflicts of interest. Unlike many startups, we also don't have an exit strategy. We build pyramids. We've been around for 50 years protecting a ledger, as opposed to immutable ledgers that will have a life expectancy longer than presumably many of the companies that are building them. We're regulated by many organizations, many supervisors around the world. We're regulated by the SEC, FINRA, the CFTC, the FCA in the UK, ESMA in Europe, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Australian Securities Investment Commission, and many others. We have deep expertise in regulatory compliance, reporting, risk management, controls, business continuity. We have a business continuity team. We have regular inspections. We conduct regular DR tests. Almost every weekend, we're conducting some outage scenario, some scenario of systems up, systems down, systems failing over. We report those results to our regulators. We work with the regulator community on new opportunities, on new technologies. We're working closely with the regulatory community on the cloud and how to leverage the cloud. And we're working closely with them to help them understand and find the opportunities with DLT. Okay, enough about DTCC. So why are we here at the Digital Asset Summit, and why are we so interested in distributed ledger technology? There you go. About a month ago, the Global Custodian newsletter published an article about how quickly market infrastructures have embraced fintech. In what they described as a brutal sense of irony, it explains how the disruptor has become disrupted by the disruptee. The financial industry incumbents can actually pivot and embrace technology. That seems to be surprising to many, but DTCC CEO also stated a few weeks ago at our annual symposium that he's certain beyond a doubt that infrastructures of today will not exist in their current form 10 years from now. We do truly believe that distributed ledger technology and some of the capabilities that it offers in terms of transforming not just technology, this is not just like implementing networks, implementing real-time, implementing relational advanced databases. This is a fundamental platform shift, even as it likely requires oversight and governance. It enables a lot of things on a peer-to-peer and an individual basis that are much more complicated today. The potential of distributed ledger is to create a single shared version of the truth. I'm going to leave aside the debate over permissioned and non-permissioned. I'm not going to talk about consuming more energy than the entire country of Ireland. I'd rather focus on the opportunities this enables, a shared version of business rules across the entire industry, a shared database, built-in multi-party workflow, peer-to-peer interactions that allow firms to get together and create their own bespoke contracts, eliminating all of the platforms that we have today that do that in pieces, in silos, that need reconciliation, eliminating databases, eliminating archives, eliminating messaging systems, eliminating queuing systems, eliminating reconciliation systems, and replacing that with a distributed version of the truth. There was a reference in an earlier panel to lowering some of the costs in a broker-dealer or sell-side's back office and how that's not interesting. It's not interesting, although it does reduce overall costs, but the point is less about lowering the costs in an individual shop The point is more that puts everybody on the same level platform, the same level playing field, and enables this new construct where some of the conversations that we had on a panel earlier about constructing new ETFs that are composed of real estate in the bottom of Manhattan is enabled. And if that could be brought into a regime of regulatory oversight and establish itself as a real security or a real tradable asset, what could come of that? The technology is still in its infancy, and it's continuing to evolve and mature. We're spending a lot of time on the technology from multiple dimensions, and I'll talk about that near the end. But it's going to require time and patience. Every technology requires time and patience. You could send a 3-year-old to college if he's smart enough, but he won't survive. He hasn't gone through the playground to get dirt kicked in his face. Technology seems to have a cycle that's very similar to the human cycle. And if you look at the internet, you look at databases, you look at mobile, look at almost any technology, it's typically in its mid to late teenage years by the time it really reaches a point of critical maturity where it could be adopted. We're 10 years into this. We've probably got a good 5 years to go before it turns into something that we all have that aha moment about. Over the decades, we've worked with our network, our community, and our owners, and we've led the industry through many transformations. That's what the industry expects of us. The industry has asked us to look at distributed ledger technology, first to determine if it can work at industry scale, which we are working on, but they've also come to us to consider different business opportunities. Some of these opportunities have ranged from challenging, like can we replace the entire equities processing platform, which is a bit of a challenge, to the ironic, like can we store this piece of paper with my encryption key and a Bitcoin address in your big vault? Yes, the decentralized digital market is asking for an old school solution. And yes, the users of the No Trust technology platform are asking help from the trusted entities. Because there's an essential truth is that this is not really no trust. Trust is basically being shifted as well as the risk. If your wallet is hacked, you lose all your money. If an exchange is hacked, you lose all your money. If you lose your encryption keys, you lose all your money. If somebody dies and takes all your encryption keys with them, you lose all your money. If the security basis of the network is hacked itself, everybody loses all their money, and there is no recourse. So DTCC is looking for that place where we can bring our risk management, our controls, our governance, the model of working with the regulators and providing the appropriate oversight with this new transformative technology and seeing if we could find that place where we meet. So we've been discussing with the industry and our regulators what a model of digital native securities can be. I will confess slight confusion and befuddlement on the semantic difference between tokenized securities and security tokens, and I'm not going to debate that or conflate it. I'll stick with the phrase tokenized securities and hope everybody knows what that means. To us, it basically means that a security that is today issued in registration form, as Mark Smith from Symbiont mentioned earlier, registration is required at the depository today. Is it possible to create registration in a simpler form where you could register on a ledger a digitally native asset as a security from an issuing company? Many benefits come from that. I'm sure many of you are already aware. You have a contained, mathematically verifiable single version of truth of those security holdings. There's more efficient, potentially real-time transfers of ownership, greater compliance and transparency, better corporate governance, such as on-chain voting and shareholder proxy issuance, and potentially more efficient and transparent asset servicing. Again, DTCC is owned by the industry, and we're focused on governance and risk management and controls. We've happened to run a mainframe for the last number of years, maintaining that central ledger, but that's not core to who we are. Core to who we are is providing safety and soundness to markets. I do want to be clear that there are a number of challenges that are still undergoing, I'll say, advancement and maturity, both within DTCC and within the industry. I would also point out that there are a couple of myths about DTCC services. that securities and money rattle around inside of our building for a couple of days before they pop out 2 days later in settlement. It's not really accurate. We receive trades every day within microseconds or milliseconds of execution from over 50 different marketplaces. The US marketplace is a horizontal market where there's many different exchanges and competition at the exchange level and best order routing for execution, which creates tremendous liquidity, creates price discovery. All of those are consolidated into a single set of trade ledgers, and the settlements are netted down. Over 99% of those trades net out, so less than 1% settlement occurs every day based on the amount of trades that are actually executed. The way markets are structured and the way market practices are is people buy what they can't pay for and they sell what they don't own. So this liquidity gap and this credit gap is usually what is resolved within 2 days. I would note that DTCC has T0 settlement, and it has had that for many years. And firms that have the money and their counterpart has the securities and they want to execute that trade same day, you submit it. Today we have a deadline that we've set at 11:30. If that trade is submitted before 11:30 for accelerated settlement, it goes right into our netting and settlement process for same day. So that exists. Things don't have to rattle around. But typically what happens is there's block allocations, there's resolving any exceptions that might occur, there's resolving settlement instructions, and the 2 days to get established liquidity and credit. There are a number of other issues that are still undergoing research. I'm not going to go into creation of standards. There's a lot of discussion about interoperability. The biggest issue right now with interoperability is there's nothing that's available to interoperate. Once you start having a couple of platforms that exist and need to interoperate with each other, we're going to see a lot more focus and a lot more progress on interoperability. Discussing interoperability standards before you actually have things to interoperate is similar to the way network standards were created about 30 years ago before there were a lot of networks out there. That network standard, OSI, was a giant failure. TCP/IP ended up winning because it was the network standard that actually worked. So we've established a high-level framework of what we believe the fundamental building blocks are in order to create an ecosystem that supports bringing this type of technology to the marketplace. We're going to start with certainty of regulatory frameworks and oversight. What are the rules that we're accountable to? There's guidance such as something called the PFMI, Principles for Financial Market Infrastructures, that continue to be relevant and even apply as technology models change. Regulators have established minimal requirements for critical industry infrastructure. They've created standards for resiliency in the infrastructure, created standards for recovery time objectives and point objectives, and without being technical, that you can't lose messages, that you have to be able to recover in a certain point of time, that you must complete clearing and settlement every single day, no matter what the disruption. So those standards exist. There's no reason those standards have to be changed. Regulations have also been created through years of market intervention, crises, practice, improvement, repeat, rinse, and all of these regulations are intended to create a safe and sound marketplace for retail investor interests. Many of those regulations are still appropriate today. The integrity of the market starts with custodial trust. Again, that word trust. A market built on tokenized assets must be able to trust on the safekeeping of those assets. Those assets being kept in various vaults in locations that are not transparent, that are not controlled, that are not subject to regulatory oversight, are not going to bring trust to the ecosystem. On-chain performance and scalability refers to what we call inside of the tech world non-functional requirements, which are really the table stakes for any viable technology. This includes scale, performance, the ability for the smart contract code to execute at high speed when it's required, even for very complex contracts, the ability to tune, monitor, and manage the resources of the technology. Most of the technologies that are deployed today and most of the nodes that are deployed today are not instrumented at all. If they slow down, if they fail, you might get a message up on the screen, fail, out of gas. Something relatively simple that basically provides you with no clue as to what the problem is. Oversight of a network and governance of a network needs to be able to make sure that your network is running and able to continue to run in a safe and sound manner at all times. And lastly, the incumbents have the network, they have the expertise, they have the regulatory interfaces and risk management and governance structures that can help enable new technology to succeed in a manner that supports the policymakers' goals of safety and soundness. There's no reason not to leverage incumbents' capabilities. So about a month ago, in working with the industry and our regulators, a lot of discussion was about what that regulatory guidance should be in terms of tokenized securities and what the industry should do in order to proceed with this type of platform. The industry came to us for some guidance. Our regulators asked us for some guidance. So we worked together and put together a white paper. The effort was led by Mark Weejan, who runs our regulatory division. He used to be the chair of the CFTC, so he has a lot of knowledge of what policymakers are looking for. And we came up with 7 basic principles that we believe should help guide. And I'm going to go through each of those briefly. First principle is establishing a legal basis for the platform. What is the law that should apply? The degrees by which laws are enforceable, it depends on where the parties are located, it depends where a tokenized security is located, and potentially where the token issuer is located. In the US, under state law, it's the law of the issuer's jurisdiction or state that governs the issuance of the security. Courts with responsibility to enforce those laws may determine asset ownership, for example, in probate or divorce proceedings that require changes in the ledger platform, potentially changes in who owns that asset. If nodes or users are outside of that jurisdictional authority, it may be impossible to enforce. Developers that make changes to the platform are typically responsible today to the organization that's providing that oversight and governance and that regulatory compliance. In an open source platform, developers can be outside of that community and outside of jurisdictions, and that may be difficult to enforce. Smart contracts are written in code, and that code will regularly involve thousands of lines of computer logic written by skilled programmers. There is a legal basis for contracts which includes offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, mutual consent, legality, and writing, and these are established and they're governed by every state. The Uniform Commercial Code created a guide for interstate commerce, but allows each state to make its own modifications. Mutual consent, which is sometimes called meeting of the minds, must be clear and supportable in a court of law. My 40 years of working in the financial industry and observing the ability for programmers to speak in business language suggests this is going to take some time to work out. The second principle is identifiable governance structure, including establishing rules, overseeing implementation, operation of the platform, ensuring it delivers the required functionality, providing risk management. The governance structure should establish protocols, operating procedures, and what to do if an exception occurs. What to do when an exception occurs, because exceptions will occur. How to transparently fix problems, ensure the platform is operating according to the governing laws and in the best interests of the network is a critical component of having an adult in the room on this process. And this includes how to stop runaway automation problems from driving the entire market over a cliff. Third is having risk management procedures and systems. To the extent that we move in this platform model toward real-time gross settlement, it creates a new set of liquidity risks, potential scale and performance issues, because if netting and pair-offs don't occur anymore and every trade settles immediately, the volume basically is 100 times what it is today. If there are custodial and asset servicing responsibilities, it brings additional operational and risk management requirements. Principle 4 is establishing clear and deterministic finality. DLT systems today provide a variety of different models for probabilistic finality. There can be forks, there can be blocks that you have to wait a certain number of blocks to determine whether your transaction is approved. Any transaction not considered final is susceptible to being unwound in the event of a bankruptcy or the insolvency of a counterparty. Bankruptcies don't often wait until a certain number of blocks have passed. Today, brokers will simultaneously buy and sell the same security, and today's settlement systems consider each of those trades to be final as executed and submitted, and they'll pair or net off those trades. In a DLT model of real-time gross settlement, each one of those sides must occur separately. If either of those sides is not finalized, the broker, the day trader, could be sitting in the middle of very enormous price risk. The rules concerning finality and the model of implementation must also account for delivery versus payment. Most DLT platforms have some kind of native currency, but if the model of execution of the security is implemented into smart language code or in some other ledger, those must be coordinated and be transactionally atomic, so they occur as one. Rules governing what that finality means are critical and should determine what the consensus and validation models should be implemented to support that. Principle number 5 is about the life cycle of tokenized assets from issuance to custody and asset servicing. The promise of the technology is a lot of that can be put into code, but appropriate operational and risk management rules and procedures must be in place to always ensure the full integrity of the ledger. Asset servicing, which includes processing and reporting dividends, distributions, shareholder voting and notices, shareholder lawsuits, processing of corporate actions, and expected activities such as or unexpected activities such as mergers is a core responsibility, and a lot of that can be automated. But in the real world, there are exception and unexpected circumstances which will be different from the original expectations that were put into the code. Platform governance must be able to account for those. Principle 6 is about resilience of market infrastructure, which is of critical concern to the regulatory community, which has continuously stepped up the expectations on infrastructure providers. Token platforms must have security, risk, and business continuity policy that include mitigating procedures and controls in case of an exception. There's a framework called the NIST framework for cybersecurity: identify, prevent, detect, respond, and recover, which applies to DLT platforms as well. Additional risks based on DLT, which include unexpected denial of service attacks, data loss, network outages, coding errors, and compromises to the security or consensus models, are all new attack vectors that must be addressed. And the final principle concerns record-keeping requirements. There's certainly an obvious strength in distributed ledger to support the full data lineage in immutable records, but different jurisdictions are going to have different requirements, for example, on reporting, on data privacy, and on data retention, and all of those must be addressed in the platform. So I'm going to very briefly, in closing, touch on some of the things that DTCC is doing in working with the community. We've been working for several years on a project to migrate a mainframe system for credit default swaps to our to a distributed ledger. We call that our trade information warehouse. We're deep into functional testing. We're nearing actually the end of functional testing on that platform, and we're doing a lot of work on the non-functional requirements now. We have an internal lab team that is working. It's contributed over 10,000 lines of code to Hyperledger. It's including several of the projects, and it's leading one of the projects, Hyperledger Explorer. We built on that Hyperledger Explorer software. We took that, and even as we're building the CDS platform, the trade warehouse, on a different technology stack, we're using Hyperledger Explorer to become an administrative and governance node function. We're working with Accenture on a distributed ledger security framework. We also worked with Accenture on a performance benchmark that we published some results publicly last fall. We've been a beta test partner for Amazon's managed distributed ledger. Their first one was Hyperledger Fabric. And we're working with a variety of industry leaders. We're on the board of the Chamber for Digital Commerce and working with policymakers. As I mentioned, we're working deeply with Hyperledger because we believe Hyperledger is the best umbrella to pull a lot of the disparate parts of the market together. And they have an extremely mature open source process developed under the Linux Foundation that maintains Linux and maintains Apache Web Server, Kubernetes, Node.js. Many of the most popular software is managed under the Linux Foundation, and even their testing capabilities almost mirror ours in terms of how robust and deep they test their software. We're members of Enterprise Ethereum Association. The International Security Servicing Association has a working group of central securities depositories that have put out some policy white papers. And we have a fintech division that is leading a lot of our efforts around exploration and experimentation with fintech. And that includes a variety of different use cases that I alluded to here and a bunch of other things the industry has asked us to look at. So in closing, I'm going to misquote someone. History is made by those who show up. So DTCC is showing up. We're here with many startups, with institutions. I will point out, as I had mentioned to the moderator, the difference between this conference and the conference uptown. The last 2 days, I was asked about Byzantine fault tolerance about a dozen times. I don't think I've heard that word mentioned here. It's actually delightful to see that this is not all about the technology. That should percolate in its own kitchen. This is all about the business opportunities that this technology enables. And we are really looking forward to working you. We're working with a number of firms in the startup community and open to other opportunities on how we could work with the industry, our clients, our regulators, and the entire community to move this technology forward for the good of everybody. Thank you very much.